Good morning, everyone. I'm Teodosio, and I'm from Women Doing Philosophy. And I'm here today to present you with a brief introduction into feminist aesthetics. Aesthetics in general concerns itself with the idea and the experience of beauty, and for some strands of philosophy, the sublime. Etymologically, it comes from the Greek word aesthesis, which generally translates to sensation. In this field of study, we concern ourselves with the following questions. First, what do we consider as aesthetic objects? Are all objects considered to be aesthetic objects, or are there some class of objects that are necessarily aesthetic objects? The second question is, what is our aesthetic attitude? What attitude do we inhabit when we are confronted with something that is different, something that we find ourselves with pleasure or displeasure, and something which evokes sentiment, feeling, memory from us? The third question is, what do we make sense of this experience? What do we do with it? When we think that we have encountered a beautiful experience or a beautiful object, so what? And the last question is, how do we arrive at the judgment? How do we make sure that what we have encountered is really the beautiful? Some questions which we may ask ourselves so that we can say that we are in the way of understanding the idea of the beautiful would be, what objects do we consider as a beautiful object? What are the characteristics do we attribute to this beautiful object? And if we feel affinity to this object. Feminist aesthetics is a criticism and recognition against how the patriarchy tarnishes even the philosophical method. Why is it important for us to take this attitude and to take this standpoint? In a way, this is a refusal to customary binary categories that we have been familiar with, not only in philosophy, but in our everyday experience of life. By marginalizing against women, the LGBTQI, the differently abled and other underprivileged sectors in society, we create a space where philosophy becomes stale and subservient solely to whichever class or group stays in power. By taking the standpoint of a critique or a criticism, feminist aesthetics forgoes tradition by investigating how the same structures have allowed the silencing and gatekeeping women, especially in their pursuits of creation, articulation, and judgments of beauty. So, how do we make sure that in this criticism, we are still on the way of studying the idea of beauty, and again, for some, the sublime? These are just some points that feminist aesthetics may look to. The first one would have to be expressions of subjectivity, the exercise of body and movement, manifestations of overt and covert power, manner and techniques of exclusion, the use of reason and understanding, cultivation of agency, consent and dissent, and the play of imagination together with the assertions and formations of identity. And of course, we ask ourselves, how do we make sure that it's really the women, the lives of women, and the voices of women are heard? The experience of beauty, our categories on how to make sense of our experience and encounter with objects, and taste for pleasure, displeasure, and disgust must be emancipated from the patriarchal gaze. So, what do? We ask women themselves. We look for women. We look for the underprivileged and marginalized groups in society. And we ask ourselves the question, why are they marginalized? And what does this mean? This means disentangling pervading structures of power in philosophy and its methods. And of course, the recognition that there is a hierarchy that exists in philosophy and in other aspects of living. This means looking for women who had struggled and continue to struggle within the circumstances. This means shaking our own assumptions about how to do philosophy itself. We avert our gaze and actively look for those who are continually crushed and silenced. We build friendships and ask women directly to use their own words, voices, images, and narratives in articulating their own experiences. Described inferiority in women has provided a unique point of analysis in how certain structures has coddled its exploration and expressions of identity in both the private and public spheres of living. The flourishing of women's works in a variety of fields, such as philosophy, literature, art, music, design, politics, sports, science, among others, signifies its ongoing fight against stereotypes and insidious ideas about women can and cannot do. These works do not merely or does not only give us an extension of subjectivities, but an ongoing building of how women constitutes and performs work by owning and engaging concepts and categories which are supposed to work against them. Women have tenuous relationships with their bodies, and by extension, with the pervading ideas of beauties, which impose sanctions on women's bodies that does not fit the current idea. Women have an intimate, although strange, relationship with beauty. Beauty always for the consumption and manipulation of others, men, markets, religion, and always last for satisfaction. What feminist aesthetics provides us is to make sure that aesthetics is not solely for the eyes of the patriarchy or for the other, but rather we see and we seek the pursuit of aesthetics or of beauty according to the eyes and lives and experiences of women. Her vision is trained not to go beyond what powers dictate, and this we might struggle against. This also extends to the use of her voice, her mind, and thoughts. Her exercise of beauty is always viewed as her charm and currency rather than its expression and extension of her own subjectivity and identity. It is never pursued for itself. It is pursued because there are social needs that she needs to fulfill. Marriage, sexual reproduction. Once you go beyond these by reclaiming her body and announcing her interest in beauty solely for its own sake, she is excluded, punished, forgotten. So, in a way, feminist aesthetics is a palate cleanser so that we make sure that the categories on beauty and the ideas on beauty, on what is considered beautiful, if this is considered beautiful, sheds the gaze of the patriarchy. Being a woman is not only a lived situation, constantly navigating tensions and limitations, both in the public and the private sphere. It also involves dancing with the different manners of how power pervades structures in society. As women, we understood how to fit depending on the social situation. And sometimes we feel that that in itself is a burden. By identifying these power structures, sources, and streams, we become nuanced performers of our own identities. We learn how to be flexible. We learn how to hide. We learn when to smile. We learn not to be hurt. We learn when to speak. And most of the time, that is not even given space. We become experts in fighting and changing manners and techniques of exclusion. We are treated as if we are not part of the conversation. And that is important when we're trying to understand how to judge things that are considered beautiful. We have to make sure that by adding these insights and realizations to our criteria of looking and investigating and receiving impressions and representations of the idea of beauty, we become informed of how power, excuse, or method. Now, before we continue, let us ask ourselves these questions pertaining to power and women's relations and exercises of power. What institutions are present in our society, and how do these institutions influence our decisions? Does our ways of looking change when presented with different objects? And how do institutions help shape our ideas of beauty? And then we shift back to ourselves. What do we think are our working definitions of what beauty is? By advocating for the formation and active employment of women's agency, we must first consider that she can decide for herself and that she can think for herself. We must also consider that this includes how they arrive at consent and dissent. This also means that she has her own mind and that she has her own judgment pertaining to things that gives her pleasure, displeasure, disgust, desire, interest, and disinterestedness. We must allow oneself to experiment with different modes and methods of creating and judging. By doing so, we discover how we bring our work further, and we discover how certain rules and criteria are applicable for certain objects, but not to others. This insight makes us see how the idea of beauty itself can become a rule and principle that we can follow in our lives. Beauty, which is not within the clutches of anyone, but is present in everyone. By having this acknowledgement, we understand that beauty, aside from the true and the good, especially within the philosophical tradition, can also be a criteria when we are trying to understand what is happening around us. Thus, it adds to our criteria on how to choose, how to act, how to imagine a future. It gives us questions like, how do we decide? And how do we know when we do not agree with what is given and presented to us? We also ask questions and we can become interested with, how do we handle disagreements? What do I do when I feel that I do not like this particular work of art? How do I enunciate and articulate my judgment? And how do I seamlessly communicate how I understand this piece of art to be meaningful or not meaningful to my life? Where can we use beauty aside from art? And what things in our everyday life do we consider as beautiful? In engaging with these problems, or philosophical problems, if I may add, we become cognizant that we as women can think for ourselves, has a willing capacity, can judge for ourselves. In engaging with objects and experiences using our own standpoint and understanding our own positionality, women learns to constantly use her own reason and criteria in judging not only aesthetic encounters, but also experiences in the social, political, and economic spheres. We become inquirers and ask ourselves, which part of me or which part of my experience as a woman does this affect? By seeing ourselves as our own woman, capable of thinking for ourselves, dreaming for ourselves, the reflexivity afforded by reason allows us to reflect on our own taste, interactions, and moves in the spheres mentioned earlier. How do we judge if what we are looking at is something that is pleasurable, something that is apt for our taste, and something that might give us pleasure or displeasure? Our relations as well to the objects of our own making provides a space not just for our creativities and imagination, but also cultivates a space for our practices of judgment, aesthetics, and otherwise. With this insight, we become accepting to thinking how we understand the relations with objects. We become curious of how does thinking help us understand even our own creative expressions. We become cognizant of reflexivity and how we think of ourselves as a person. And we ask questions like, how does thinking help us understand the idea of beauty further? And what does thinking about beauty provide us? Encounters of beautiful objects as well may also change our perspective, and this becomes clear when we ask ourselves, where is the idea of beauty important? Not only in judging what is outside of my experience, but importantly, the judging of what are my criteria when I'm trying to interact with the world. In this study of aesthetics and its brief introduction, we asked, why is it important to talk about the struggles of women? Well, we could not have a working method mode of philosophizing if we do not acknowledge that even within the tradition of philosophy, there are hierarchies that exist. The recognition of women's struggle remains important in our study of aesthetics. Without this, we will not understand how certain views are exalted while others are suppressed, why this painting is considered more beautiful than the other, and why certain artists are not talked about, or why certain works of art, pieces of literature, and music are not played for the general public. Only when we start to see how violence and erasures pervade the lives of women and the lives of other marginalized sectors in our society can we liberate our ways towards a pure attempt of studying aesthetics. We cannot and must not deny how women are treated as mere currency and mere bodies for the desires of men and others. Rather than be players, women become pawns, thrown once damaged, forgotten once aged. And we get this when we look into our social media accounts. We see this in television and in different emerging technologies. And we see how bodies of women and the ideas of women is marketed, not just for our own satisfaction, but as means and objects to other people's desires. Only through advocating for the place of women can we say that philosophy truly liberates. Otherwise, we remain as a lip service. Once we see ourselves as part of the greater world, and once we allow ourselves the freedom given to others, assertions and formations of identity become less of a burden and more of fortune. The discovery of our identities according to our rules, according to our words, and according to our vision and images, and the recognition that we can remake them according to our rules provide our sources of value and explorations of human dignity. We become confident of ourselves, we become confident with our narratives, our projections, our dreams, and we readily embrace our dignities as human beings. We shed the shame that the patriarchy has told us we as women hold. We rediscover our desires without outside interference. We get reacquainted with our own force that we can wield as and for our own. We become autonomous beings and we see the world differently. Putting ourselves forward voice our will to live, our will to create, our will to build. This recognition frees us into contemplating beauty further as an end in itself. As we are, we propel ourselves towards the future, a future that exists for everyone rather than for some. With this, we ask questions again, like, so now, what constitutes our will? And why is this will forceful? What restrictions have been put on this will? And how do these restrictions affect our desires? In the end, we ask ourselves, how do we judge and why must we constantly judge the state of affairs? In this brief introduction, we hope that we allow ourselves to use not only our judging faculty, but our thinking and willing capacities as well. We can only do this when we open ourselves to different kinds of experiences. And for this, we command that others provide us the space that should have been our own in the first place. We can only do this if we recognize that there are marginalized groups in our society. The pursuit of beauty cannot be divorced from the pursuit of a well-meaning, free and good and just world. These ideals cannot be owned and not be wielded against human beings by human beings. By allowing ourselves to be judged well, we do good without philosophizing, with our philosophizing, and we become closer into understanding how beauty as a criteria maintains a central role in our lives. For the last self-checklist, which for me gives us the space to ask ourselves and to further reflect and discern where we stand on things, we have these couple of questions. First one is, given our lives, given our position in society, given our own experiences, whatever they may be, we ask ourselves, how do we judge? How do we judge our situations? And how do we judge our encounters with others not only objects, but also with our fellow human beings? When should we suspend judgment? Or in which situations should we suspend judgment? How do we ensure that our judging faculty is sound? How do we maintain our healthy judgment? And we ask ourselves as well questions. Why are we afraid to judge? Where's the fear coming from? And whose fear is this? And how do we make sure that we always judge well? Again, thank you very much for allowing me this space to present a basic introduction to feminist aesthetics. Again, I'm Cassie Teodosio and I'm from the Women Doing Philosophy. Thank you.